Frederick Bailey, born in 1818 of a slave mother and an unknown father in Talbot County, Maryland, on the eastern shore of Chesapeake Bay. From these beginnings, Frederick Bailey taught himself to read and then to write. He practiced by reading newspapers, then books, and all of this in secret, while undergoing the trials and humiliation of a slave. Determined to escape, he finally did so at the age of 20, September the 3rd, 1838. And within a few years, he had become the most well-known African American of his day, a tireless worker for the cause of abolition. Taking on a new name from Walter Scott's Lady of the Lake, Frederick Bailey became Frederick Douglass. Douglass not only lived to see the emancipation of the slaves 27 years after his own escape to freedom, but he lived another third of a century. And it is testament to his power and achievement that he founded an abolitionist newspaper, that he supported the developing women's rights movement for over 40 years, that he wrote 3 separate autobiographies, that he worked to get Abraham Lincoln elected in 1860, and eventually Frederick Douglass returned to the South. He purchased and ran a newspaper in the city of Washington. He was appointed by President Ulysses S. Grant as Assistant Secretary to Santo Domingo. He was appointed the U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia, and he was appointed Recorder of Deeds in the District of Columbia. And finally, in his late years, he was appointed as Consul General to Haiti. Considering his beginnings, his career is one of the most remarkable in American history. Welcome to English 3350, a survey of American literature before the Civil War. We're in Studio 3 in the M.D. Anderson Library on the main campus of the University of Houston. I'm Barry Wood, and today we're beginning to look at 2 writers of the American slave tradition, 2 of the most remarkable stories to come out of this very interesting period in the 20 or 30 years before the Civil War. By the 16th century, Africa had a well-developed culture with political structure, with a long succession of empires going back many centuries, with well-developed politics and religion, and in fact a distinctive artistic tradition, lots of wood carving and metalware, some truly outstanding work has been found from these early years in Africa. But all of that was interrupted when Europeans arrived. The first African American slaves went to Portugal even before America was discovered. In some cases, that was a matter of betrayal by some of their own people. It became a practice, for instance, for those who broke the law within some African groups to be made into slaves on home territory and then to be sold in preparation for the next group of slave buyers, and then they would be sold into captivity. And so scores, hundreds, thousands, and eventually millions of African Americans were transported from the coasts of Africa, taken aboard ships. First, even before Columbus sailed, they were taken to Portugal. But even almost as soon as the Americas were settled, slave ships began to arrive, first in the Caribbean, The first slave ship actually arrived in Jamestown in 1619, which was just a very few years after Jamestown had been founded, and it was just 1 year before Plymouth Plantation was founded a little further to the north. Between 1520 and 1810, when the importation of African slaves actually was halted, 12 million Africans were captured and shipped out as slaves. They were packed into the holds of ships. Of those 12 million, approximately 2 million died en route to the New World. They were packed in almost like animals into the holds of these ships. Many were thrown overboard. Any that rebelled were simply thrown overboard or killed on the spot. And so only a percentage of these actually arrived. And the effect on Africa was profound. For approximately 300 years, African civilization was systematically robbed of its youth. Europe turned African slaves into economic gain for itself. And while African development was virtually stopped for 3 centuries, Europe and its colonial offspring, including the United States, piled up the labor of African hands and built wealth and privilege for those who seized, shipped, and owned African slaves. 10 million Africans reached the Americas in the holds of these ships. There's a modern rendition of what conditions were like in those ships. Of these, 500,000, actually only about 5% of those shipped out of Africa came to the British colonies in North America. That's a fact that's not too well known. Of course, with more known around the world about the United States, the fact of slavery here is prominent in people's minds and in the eyes of the world. But 95% of African Americans went to other colonies in the Caribbean and in South America. The English and the French together accounted for less than half of the African Americans shipped out. More than half were shipped out by the Spanish, particularly to Brazil, which absorbed about 6 times the number of Africans that were absorbed by the British colonies. Slavery ended more than 130 years ago, yet the scars of this tragic side of American history remain and probably will remain for a long, long time to come. Well, August 1841, a meeting of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. The location was almost symbolic, the island of Nantucket, a kind of safe haven for those opposed to what went on the mainland United States. This had been long a home of Quakers who had tended towards an abolitionist position for some time. Nantucket was also the home of the very prominent Coffin family. William Coffin was a bookkeeper in New Bedford. There he had discovered a young man and had invited this young man, an African American, to attend. Night of August 16th, 1841, well along in the proceedings, this young man rose to his feet. He was then aged 23, and he was moved to speak. Hesitant, stammering, frightened, he nevertheless did manage to get started, and then impelled by the incredible life that he had led in his short 23 years, he poured out his story. It was an historic moment, The man was Frederick Douglass, destined to become the most prominent African American of his day. The story he poured out was a simple one about his birth as a slave in Maryland, Chesapeake Bay, how along the way he had somehow managed to learn to read and write, despite the fact that it was illegal for African Americans to do so, how he had bided his time and waited and planned, made one abortive attempt at escape, which had not been successful, and finally on September 3rd, 1838, just 3 years before this particular night, he had made good that escape, and in 24 tension-filled hours, he had finally reached New York, broke and alone. And that was just 35 months before this occasion when he got up to speak at the Massachusetts Society for Slavery and electrified the audience. The audience, as I say, included a lot of Quakers, but it also included a substantial number of free African Americans from the mainland. And in fact, we could get some picture of how the African American was regarded, even in a place like Massachusetts, even in the safe haven of the North. This group was not allowed to speak in the main building. The trustees of most conservative public buildings where speeches might go on typically did not allow abolitionist groups to speak. Well, Frederick Douglass was at that point a fugitive slave. Even though he had been free for 3 years, he lived in a time when I suppose something like posses from the South occasionally roamed through the North and watched for escaped slaves, and if they could capture them, they often returned them to their owners in the South. In fact, Frederick Douglass remained a fugitive slave for 9 years after his escape in 1838, and that status did not change until his freedom was literally purchased from his former owner in Maryland. Among those present was this man, William Lloyd Garrison, the most prominent abolitionist leader of the times, founder of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society 10 years earlier, and in fact, he was publisher of the Liberator, which was the most prominent abolitionist paper in the South at that time. After Frederick Douglass had finished speaking, William Lloyd Garrison got to his feet and he shouted out to the people, "Have we been listening to a thing, a chattel personal, or a man?" A man, came back the shouts from the audience. "Shall such a man be held a slave in a Christian land?" And the responses came back, "No, no." "Shall such a man ever be sent back to bondage from the free soil of old Massachusetts?" And again the shouts were, "No, no." That was the beginning. Frederick Douglass then went on to become the most prominent platform speaker for the cause of abolition of his time. From hundreds, perhaps thousands of platforms across the northern states, this man told his story. He was not the only one. There were, of course, dozens of escaped slaves who had somehow found their way to the north, had somehow become allied with the abolitionist movement. And all in all, there were probably 100 written stories of escaped slaves, slave narratives they're called today. But Frederick Douglass became the most powerful spokesman for the ending of slavery, for the full humanity of the African American, and for the failure of the Christian religion among those who practiced slavery. 4 years after that first speech, and after hundreds more across the northern states, Frederick Douglass published his autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself. Small book, no more than 100 pages. 30,000 copies of this book sold in 5 years, 9 editions in England. 10 years later, he published a second autobiography, enlarged, now more than 400 pages in length, known as My Bondage and My Freedom. Came out in 1855. The first one, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself, ended just a few pages after his escape to freedom. The second, My Bondage and My Freedom, went on for 75 pages beyond his bondage, treating his subsequent freedom in largely summary form. And he went on to write a third autobiography, 26 years later, in 1881, a work known as The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. So over and over again, he put his story before the American people. This was perhaps his central importance, that again and again he did put this story in front of the American people, and it was this for which he became most well known. Let's look at here is an account of an evening when Frederick Douglass spoke. The place was Concord, New Hampshire. This account is by Nathaniel Rogers, who was an abolitionist editor of the Concord newspaper, the Herald of Freedom. And he describes what it was like to see Frederick Douglass speak. He began by a calm, deliberate, and very simple narrative of his life. He, to be sure, had to go naked pretty much during the earlier years of childhood and feed at the trough like a pig. He never knew in his first 6 years anything about a bed. He remembered stealing an old salt bag into which he used to creep and sleep on the earth floor of the Negro hut. His own back, he said, was scarred with the whip. Well, that is only one of several accounts by listeners, by those who saw Frederick Douglass and heard him speak, but the points that are remembered here by Nathaniel Rogers, I think, reveal very well the sorts of details that did blaze themselves into the mind of those who attended his many talks. So Frederick Douglass's principal contribution then is telling his story. Telling the story live from the platform, repeating it again and again. And he continued this for years, certainly from 1841 to 1843. Steadily he told his story. And then for about a year he spent working on his narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, which was published in 1845. After the publication of the narrative of Frederick Douglass in 1845, his true identity was now known, made public, and it was clear that he could, in fact, be in danger. And so, in August of 1845, he left for England, and he remained there for over a year and a half. One could say, I suppose, that this was part of his life as a fugitive, being in England beyond the reach of Southern owners. He spent 3 months touring Ireland, most of 1846 touring England and Scotland. He spoke repeatedly, told his story to huge audiences. A good index of his success, perhaps, is that British anti-slavery advocates raised 150 pounds, the equivalent perhaps of $700 or $800 today, to buy his freedom from his former owner, to in fact make legal his separation from his former owner in Massachusetts. Now, of course, from a northern point of view, this would be unnecessary. The whole concept of buying him from his former owner works only in a southern context at that time, where the African-American slave is regarded as property and therefore something that can be bought and sold. But nevertheless, and of course most African-Americans who escaped they naturally regarded the whole concept of ownership, which could be bought and sold, as something fictitious and morally wrong. But it's interesting that Frederick Douglass assured his legality not only in the North but in the South by this act of purchasing his freedom from his former owner. And that took place 9 years after his escape. Why was it important for him to tell his story over and over again? None of those in the audience in the North, or few of those in the audience in the North, had any idea of what slavery entailed. None of them had witnessed it. Opposition to slavery by the abolitionists was abstract. It was based on general principles of equality or economic principles. The South made too high a profit on its goods. The North, having industrialized, made a smaller profit, more like 8 or 10%, because machinery is expensive. The South remained unindustrialized. Its economy was based on the human machine, replaceable. It reproduces itself, it feeds itself. So the costs were low, and the result was that profits ran 25 or 30% in the South. And so there was opposition to slavery on economic grounds by Northerners and on, as I say, general principles of equality. What Frederick Douglass and others like him did was provide first-hand knowledge to these abolitionists of what slavery was really like. Did abolitionists really understand that families were divided, husbands from wives, parents from children, siblings from each other? Well, Frederick Douglass told them in no uncertain terms. Did Northerners realize that slaves were punished? Well, yes, probably. That would be a general assumption. Punished for disobedience. Well, Frederick told them more, not simply that they were punished, but that they were tied, harassed, chained, whipped, beaten. Women were often stripped to the waist. Their backs were laid open with 30 or 40 stripes of the whip. For what? Very little. Sometimes owners simply had a vicious streak of cruelty. Sometimes it was simply pure sadism. Often slave owners believed that it was simply necessary to undertake a beating or two a day in order to keep order. Did Northern abolitionists really understand that white owners often used black women with impunity, with no redress by the women, with no redress by the woman's black husband? Well, Frederick Douglass told them in no uncertain terms. Did Northern abolitionists know that white owners could literally get away with murder? Well, Frederick Douglass told them. He told the story, for instance, of slave master Gore, a man who, when he couldn't get obedience from a young African American who took to the river to escape from a beating, after commanding him to come ashore 3 times and he didn't, Gore simply went and got a rifle and shot him dead in the river. Did Northerners know that no white man could be convicted in the South on the word of a black man? Not even on the word of 100 or 1,000 African American witnesses? Well, Frederick Douglass made that clear too. Did Northerners know that it was a crime in the South to teach an African American to read? Here we are in the middle of New England, a people who have been dedicated to learning and literacy for 200 years. A people who founded America's first university in 1636, just 6 years after the founding of Massachusetts Bay, learning that in the South it is illegal to teach an African American to read. They hardly understood that this was part of the whole strategy of slavery, to keep the mind of the African American deliberately in darkness, to keep the African American in a state of illiteracy. There were people in New England who could not face these facts. Here, for instance, is what William Lloyd Garrison wrote in the preface to William Douglas's narrative. So profoundly ignorant of the nature of slavery are many persons that they are stubbornly incredulous whenever they read or listen to the cruelties. They do not deny that the slaves are held as property, but that terrible fact seems to convey to their minds no idea of injustice. Tell them of cruel scourgings, of mutilations and brandings, and the effect to be indignant at such exaggerations. People really didn't want to believe that these things could happen. Not in the enlightened nation of the United States. Well, Frederick Douglass stood before these people time and again and convicted Southern slave owners of these atrocities. He was then truly an educator in laying forth the facts of slavery. A second importance for Frederick Douglass is that he presented a new image of the African American in the northern states. We have to keep in mind the image that Northerners had. They literally knew nothing about African Americans. What they saw were posters like this. Sales of African Americans. Here it says, the owner of the following named and valuable slaves, being on the eve of departure for Europe, will cause the same to be offered for sale at the new exchange, corner of St. Louis and Chartres Street on Saturday, May 16th at 12 o'clock. And then they would be named, who they were, their age, their health, and so on. This was the sort of thing that Northerners saw. This was their only understanding. And without ever getting to know African Americans firsthand, seeing them only as abstract things, even though they were against the whole concept, seeing them only as abstract chattels that were in part of the United States, things to be bought and sold, even the northern abolitionists really did not have a concept of what an African American was. Now, Frederick Douglass faced these people who still were prejudiced, very much so. They often did harbor suspicions that the African American was, in fact, inferior. Even though they lobbied for their liberation, they really didn't have a fully developed concept of the African American as people. And this is indicated in the fact that they often, in more conservative places, would not give over their halls and meeting houses for meetings of abolitionists. And thus, the abolitionist groups were uniformly required to speak from very cramped quarters, often from general stores, hardware stores, and so on. In this climate, there was a great deal of room and a very great need for a man like Frederick Douglass. He stood before people, self-taught in the English language, a powerful master of the English language, a captivating speaker, authoritative and eloquent. He articulated the rights of man in languages the listeners understood. He was fully conversant with the founding documents of the nation, such things as the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and of course the Constitution. Here, for instance, is a passage from one of the most important speeches ever given in 1852. At its foundations, of course, stands Frederick Douglass's very solid grasp of American history and his understanding of the place of freedom and equality in the system. This is the 4th of July, the birthday of your national independence. He's speaking to white Northerners, and of your political freedom. This to you is what the Passover was to the emancipated people of God. Here's a man that can talk to Christian whites about their own religion, about the Bible. The whole scene of 1776, as I look back to it, was simple, dignified, and sublime. The signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men, truly brave men, truly great men. Such mastery of American ideology, the ability to cite from the founding documents of the country, to apply biblical passages to the situation, above all, to present himself as a man of learning, of intelligent, thoughtful, aroused, and always aroused in the face of an overwhelming injustice. All of this was a necessary thing for these people. It was part of the building of a new image of the African American, because, as I say, their image was undeveloped. It was shot full of prejudice. They'd only knew of African Americans as chattels in the South who were bought and sold. But Frederick Douglass always went a little further. Fellow citizens, pardon me, and allow me to ask, what have I or those I represent to do with your national independence? I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity bequeathed by our fathers is shared by you, not by me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice. I must mourn. To drag a man in fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in joyous anthems were inhuman mockery and sacrilegious irony. Do you mean, citizens, to mock me by asking me to speak today? A perspective, you see, that no white person in the audience could possibly have anticipated. And yet here he was, a black man with an impeccable logic, literally driving people into the corner with the aborted principles of the American nation. And of course, his very image of intelligence, of wrongful treatment, of a man who deserved to be free, being treated in the way that he had been treated for 20 years of his life. All of this had an effect of breaking down the prejudices of speakers. They were challenged. It was impossible to argue that this man was in any way inferior. His self-acquired education, something that few people can do. Few whites, few blacks, few people of any race can do, to acquire the skill of reading virtually without any assistance whatever. His very broad reading, his knowledge of history, his knowledge of religion, his mastery of fundamentals placed him in most cases far above those who heard or saw him. This was one of the most important things about Frederick Douglass. The image he presented, a kind of counter-image to the one that abolitionists already had. And so in his determined presentation of himself in this fashion, Frederick Douglass became a living example of the kind of man who should have freedom and equality with all other Americans. To this he added his own very powerful logic. Here's an account. Douglass spoke excellently Sunday afternoon. He was advertised as a fugitive from slavery. He said he was not a fugitive from slavery, but a fugitive slave, a fugitive in slavery. To get from it, he must go beyond the limits of the American Union. He asked them why. Why was it that he must wander about in their midst, a fugitive and a slave? And here we get a glimmer of the kind of rhetorical approach that he made to people. He asked pointed questions which had no real answer that anyone would care to give or would be willing to accept. He is in a kind of relentless logic. He confronted people with the contradictions of their own society. Of course, the Northerners wanted to get rid of slavery. They saw these contradictions too. But what Frederick Douglass put before them was the absolute urgency of the situation, that as long as slavery existed, there was an immense wrong within American society, huge contradictions. The ideals that had been formulated in 1776 and in the Bill of Rights in 1791 and the Constitution, these things had been aborted, and they remained not in force even at this point, 60, 70 years after these documents. These things had really not come into force. He demanded the reason. "It is because of your religion," he said. "It is because of your religion," he sternly replied, "which sanctifies the system under which I suffer and dooms me to it. And the millions of my brethren now in bondage. Your religion justifies our tyrants, and you are yourselves our enslavers. I see my enslavers here in concord and before my eyes." And this, I think, is probably also one of the most important things about Frederick Douglass, that his method of logic was to somehow subvert the cool, rational, sort of New England logical mind. Remember, it was these same people who in these years were largely Unitarian, largely people that had come out of the Enlightenment, coolly logical, brought up to think in unemotional terms. And that sort of person perhaps is always in the danger of working only at a logical level, of sort of clunking out premises and conclusions as if they're just mathematical equations that one works down the page, reducing numbers to common denominators and so on. Frederick Douglass wouldn't let them do that. He implicated people, his listeners, in the enslavement process. As long as slavery exists on American soil, you are to blame. It is your failing. It is the failing of your country. It is the failing of your ideals, your professed liberty, your Bill of Rights. And relentlessly, he hammered away at this. He would not allow people to simply blame this on the South. He wanted also for people to realize that it could be blamed squarely on the North as long as the North permitted and allowed and tolerated the South to continue. And so you can see in the 1840s and 1850s that Frederick Douglass is paving the way very much for the kind of war that would come in 1860. One could see the influence, for instance, of Frederick Douglass on someone like Abraham Lincoln, who, while he was still in the Senate, 2 years before he was elected, Abraham Lincoln stood up and said, "This country really cannot survive half slave and half free. Either this country will become all a slave country, South and North, or it must become all free, North and South. But it cannot survive in this half and half situation." And one can see the powerful influence of someone like Frederick Douglass upon Abraham Lincoln. And we need to keep in mind that Frederick Douglass did work in Abraham Lincoln's election campaign. Frederick Douglass had a way of presenting the issues that brought out the paradoxes, the absurdities, the ironies of American society. And he became one of the best at doing this in his time. He was called by the New York Tribune the representative man of his race in America by virtue of self-help. Douglass himself was very fond of pointing out that he had become what he was, that he had achieved the position he had because he was a thief and a robber, he said. This head, these limbs, this body were stolen from my master. By plunging his northern audience into a southern viewpoint that slaves were property owned by them and that slaves did not own their heads, their limbs, and body, Frederick Douglass brought home the reality of slavery in America. And such masterful ways of framing the issue of human enslavement was a large part of his success. Looking at his life, one would be hard-pressed to predict what he became. Born of a slave mother who died when he was just 8 years old, an unknown father, rumored to be his master. He did not know his birth date or his age. And it's only modern research looking into documents with meticulous precision that allows us now to place his birth probably sometime in February of 1818. Slavery, Douglass once said, left me without an intelligible beginning in the world. Slavery, too, left him without any formal education. Remarkable then it was that he learned to read. Mrs. Sophia Old taught him little more than the alphabet before she was prevented from further instruction. Yet Frederick Douglass learned from this incident. In preventing his wife from further teaching of Douglass, Hugh Old said, learning would spoil the best nigger in the world because there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. That was enough for Frederick Douglass, hearing that. If reading and writing were dangerous, if these things would unfit him for slavery, these, in his mind, were the things that he must learn if he was ever going to cease to be a slave. An interesting logic. And so he learned to read and write, literally stealing knowledge from under the noses of his masters, carrying forbidden books, getting white boys to fill in the puzzle, reading Baltimore newspapers where you get hold of them. And finally, at age 13, he bought a copy of the Columbian Orator, a book that was being used in the schools, full of all kinds of speeches. This says the Columbian Orator containing a variety of original and selected pieces together with rules calculated to improve youth and others in the ornamental and tasteful art of eloquence. So these were readings, and there were great speeches in this work, and it was used in the schools. And of course, Douglass had seen the book being carried by white children. He knew it was important, and so he made an effort to acquire a copy when he could. And he learned from this book, from the great speeches that were contained in it. He learned oratory. He learned eloquence, laid the groundwork for his future life's work. Reading and writing did unsuit Frederick Douglass for slavery. He acquired the keys to knowledge. He came to know that there were principles in the world like selfhood and liberty. He came to know there were places in the world where there was no slavery. States to the north. A startling thought, but when you think about it, a slave born into a world where there is nothing but masters and slaves would, of course, naturally think that that's all there was. And it was a revelation to him to read and learn that there were places where it was different, where people were actually free. And then he learned why African Americans were slaves, because white people from Europe had gone to Africa and purchased these people precisely to bring them to America to work as slaves. And armed with such fragments of a wider view, Frederick Douglass began to emerge as a man. Reading and writing were the keys to Frederick Douglass's future. And we'll come back to that in just a few minutes. For the moment, we need to look at a crucial incident in his life. In that long central section in chapter 10 of the narrative, Frederick Douglass called it an epic in my humble history. This is his confrontation with Master Covey. The balance of power, if we wish to call it that, is all on the side of the master, in this case Covey. By age 16, Frederick Douglass is big enough, powerful enough to physically beat anyone, any of the masters or their peers, anyone who might cross him. But the balance of power still allows Covey to beat him whenever he pleases. There was no choice for the slave who wished to survive. Survival required submission. One could be hung, for instance, for assaulting a white. But in this incident, a crucial one in his development, we see him in one long afternoon. Douglass is determined now that he will never feel the whip again, holds off Covey for a full 2 hours. And when he momentarily gets help from two others, Douglass chases them off and continues the confrontation with Covey. Effectively, what he does is he reduces his master status to an equal status with Douglass, long enough to make it clear that on that level he cannot win, that he would be no match. And it's a remarkable incident. It shifts the balance of power. Douglass effectively challenged the whole power system, and he won, forced his master to a truce with the whip. It did not liberate Frederick Douglass from slavery, but it was an act of self-affirmation and a restructuring of the master-slave relationship, an act of self-creation, one of many in this book. Everyone understands, of course, physical force. No one grows up, certainly no young boy in today's society grows up without a continual negotiation with peers and bigger boys. And growing up to manhood, even in our modern society, is very much a continual sort of give and take in which power is tested in this fashion. Everyone understands that. But as students of literature, we're interested in another form of self-creation by words. Frederick Douglass learning to read, mastering words, is in fact a form of self-creation that those of us who've grown up with literacy all our lives can scarcely appreciate. But we need to think about words. In the real world, in our real lives, we think of words primarily as operating in the first of those two ways we've described, either as descriptive labels for a world that we confront or as referential words to describe the real world we live in. Scarcely do we realize that the imaginative use of words, that third use that we've been talking about all through this course, is in fact essential to human identity. Imaginative language, we often associate it with the arts, with writing of poetry, with the writing of stories, with novels, with fiction, with fantasy. These are the imaginative use of words is the use that creates separate realities. But if we think about what makes us human, we will realize that it is also the imaginative use of words in our own lives that gives us an identity. We're here, for instance, in this course, taking this course, and we are looking forward to a time when the course will be done and there will be a grade on our grade report. We're looking forward to the time when all our courses will be done and we'll have a certificate, a degree on the wall. Scarcely do we realize that because the grade does not yet exist, the grade report is yet to come, the certificate is yet to be rewarded, that what we are working with is something that does not exist. Each of us creates our separate reality of the future, the world that is not yet here, but which we want to see come for us. We hardly realize this. We think about our degree as if it's a real thing. Well, it will be real perhaps in a year or 2 or 3, but right now it is a separate reality, possible only because we are human beings who can imaginatively create a future that may one day come. And it is the ability to project what we want to be, what we want to become, what we want to achieve. All of this not through referential language, but through imaginative language, in which we create our own future story. This is what is the essence of the human situation. Suppose we imagine a situation in which all power to plan were removed. All conception of planning for the future were gone. Suppose no plans could be made because at any moment we could be sold. Imagine a situation where all our power of words is denied, where we do not have the language, the conceptual ability to create an alternative future. This is essentially the situation of the slave. Who can make a plan if one can be sold tomorrow? Who can dream of getting to a free place if free places are not known? Who can imagine anything else but slavery if all there is slavery? But then you see, Frederick Douglass was able to break out of that because of the power of words, the power of reading presented him with the alternatives. There was a free world. There were such concepts as liberty. There was a situation in which one would own one's own body, that it would not belong to someone else. And these were like revelations to this young man. Words like abolition, it comes up in the text. He doesn't know what abolition is, but he knows it's very important, and he listens to it. And when he finally figures out what abolition means, that too is a revelation to him. So this is really what reading and words finally mean to him. It's the emergence of something different. Something different from what he has experienced. Am I not a man and a brother? This is an emblem of one of the anti-slavery societies. And with words in this fashion, he is thus able to recreate himself, to discover, first of all, with words, with language, another reality, and then he is able to fashion for himself another reality. And to understand this is to grasp Frederick Douglass. Each time he got to his feet to make a speech, it was in fact an act of self-creation. In telling his story, he was telling how he broke out of something that was less than human. He was telling a story of how he achieved something like manhood, partly by physical force, partly by determination, partly by the acquiring of the most important aspect of liberty, and that is the power of words, literacy. And this was a discovery of something that, of course, is central to democracy. We don't often think about this, but education is something that expanded enormously in America with the concept of democracy, the idea of the individual vote. while kings and princes were in control and they made decisions and peasants had no input, there was no need for the peasantry to be educated. Once you formulated an idea that the power rested with the people, that governments were instituted by people, that people would put others into power and take them out of power, then the absolute necessity for education of the people became central. And it's thus that in the late 18th century, right around the time of these founding documents, that we get this enormous development of higher education on the principle that you must educate the general public. And this, of course, seems so obvious to people today. It's hard for us to imagine that the world was seen in any other way. But, of course, given this structure, one can see why education was not important in the eyes of the early founders for the African American, because they were not regarded as people, they were regarded as property. They were not looked upon as people who would cast a vote, who would hold the balance of power, and so education wasn't important. Not only that, education was recognized as a horrendous danger to the whole institution of slavery. Douglas's owners were exactly right. To give people the ability to read is to destroy them as far as usefulness for slavery. No longer could you rely on them. They would be gone at the first opportunity. And Frederick Douglass was gone at the first opportunity. And so the whole acquisition of language by Frederick Douglass, as recounted in his various autobiographies, is the absolute key to his identity, to his achievement of status as an American with equality. And in the same way that he created himself from nothing to something by the acquiring of words, he recreates himself each time he stands up in front of people and tells the story of his self-creation by words. Frederick Douglass's power as a public speaker, unmatched. There were, of course, lots of escaped slaves, and lots of them were asked to testify, but none of them had the power and the authority to convict people in the way that Frederick Douglass did. He did it by his firsthand experience. First of all, his experience as a slave, and then his long planning and his escape, and his rise to education, his discovery of learning, and until he could stand before people, having literally come out of the darkness, he could stand before people as a kind of enlightened man, far better enlightened than most of them were. He contradicted all the stereotypes. No longer could people hold some sort of vague, dark view of the shuffling African locked in perpetual ignorance. Not Frederick Douglass. His words revealed knowledge of history, a command of principles, logic. He was a graceful, imposing, confident, very manly sort of man, modest. He was gentle, too. Amazing, considering the harshness of the world that he grew up in. The result of years upon years of forbearance. He was capable of a fearsome kind of elegance. And there were, of course, times when he had to confront force. There was this famous incident, for instance, in Indiana, where he became a victim of violence late in his life, while he was serving in Washington. His home in Rochester, New York, where he had lived for about 25 years. His home was burned, and most of his important papers were lost, and it is generally believed that this was a case of arson. And so, and of course, this was long after the liberation of the slaves, and this was in the North. This was in the liberated North. But he remained through these sorts of incidents a man of gentleness. It is remarkable, for instance, that he was able to return to the South, that he was able to live in the South, that he was able to confront people. He, for instance, was by the bedside of his former owner, the man who he had escaped from. He was by his bedside with him when his former owner died. A remarkable act of generosity. And this was what was so unusual about him. We see him, for instance, returning to the place of his childhood, getting involved with the people who had wronged him, and learning to live in their midst, learning to deal with them, and never with an act of violence or retaliation. I mean, one could imagine, having gone through what he did, one could imagine the sense of needing vengeance, and now that he's a powerful man, of going back and exacting exacting some kind of vengeance. But Frederick Douglass was above all that. This was part of what makes him such a remarkable sort of example in this whole era, a very tension-filled era, incidentally, before the Civil War. Perhaps you have a sense from just reading him and thinking about him and so on of the enormous tension that was rising in the United States. An abolitionist movement beginning in the 1820s and through the 1830s and 40s, which involved many, many prominent people, many leaders, constant meetings, newspapers that had been set up specifically to deal with the whole business of abolition. Nevertheless, despite his gentleness, he could present almost a frightening aspect on stage. Here, for instance, is an account of his stage presence. After narrating his early life and giving, I suspect, no token to the audience of what was coming, though I discerned at times symptoms of a brewing storm, he closed his slave narrative and gradually let out the outraged humanity that was laboring in him in indignant and terrible speech. It was not oratory or eloquence. It was sterner, darker, deeper than these. It was the volcanic outbreak of human nature long pent up in slavery and at last bursting its imprisonment. It was the storm of insurrection. And I could but think as he stalked to and fro on the platform, roused up like the Numidian lion, how that terrible voice of his would ring through the pine glades of the South in the day of her visitation. He was not up as a speaker performing. He was an insurgent slave taking hold on the right of speech and charging on his tyrants the bondage of his race. One of our editors ventured to cross his path by a rash remark. he better have run upon a lion. It was fearful, but magnificent to see how magnanimously and lion-like the royal fellow tore him to pieces and left his untouched fragments scattered around him. There he is. You could sense the power, the physical presence of the man, even in this picture taken 30, 35 years after this time of a high period of his early speeches. He was a kind of fierce-looking man, and yet with a fierceness that was capable of great gentleness. As I say, remarkable, given his background. Of course, one thing that scarcely mentioned is that he was helped in Baltimore in 1838 to escape by a young black woman who was in fact free. She provided a crucial step in his escape, and on, as I said, September 3rd, 1838, he reached New York on the next day, immediately called for her to follow, and she did. And on the 15th of September, just 2 weeks later, they were married. And he went on, of course, to raise a large family, to raise a family in the way that he knew a family ought to be raised, a family that never got divided up in the way that his own family did. One experience he had was 40 years after he was a man of 60, and he was reunited with one of his brothers who had, during his slavery years in Massachusetts, during his teenage years, his brother had been sold and shipped south. And Frederick Douglass had the experience of meeting that brother and being reunited 40 years after the event. Well, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass is, of course, an autobiography, most certainly. And as I've said, it is a kind of act of self-creation, an extension of hundreds of platform speeches that Frederick Douglass delivered. But it has another dimension. It conveys a message to the audience. Of course, we've seen this in Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, also one of the greats. It's designed to teach, to present an image, to present a possibility. In the case of Franklin, it was the possibility of perfecting oneself. For Frederick Douglass, it has another goal, and in this sense, the narrative is often called a Jeremiad. The name is taken from the Old Testament prophet Jeremiah, who lived in the early part of the 6th century BC, the author of a ferocious prophetic book, who predicted the downfall of Jerusalem and then lived to see it when the Babylonians came in 587 BC and conquered Jerusalem and marched thousands away to Babylon. In this sense, the narrative of Frederick Douglass is a kind of exhortation to move. It describes a situation which is unjust, something that needs to be changed, something that demands attention. It exhorts people to take up the cause, to change, to bring reform, to overthrow, to recreate. And it does all this from a platform, a prophetic sort of platform of personal commitment. This is my life. This is how it is with me. This is what has happened. This is what must be done. Rise up with me and let's get started. It's a Jeremiad designed to rouse the sleeping, to goad the apathetic, to challenge people, to present them with the values that they hold and challenging them to take up those values and apply them to this situation. A remarkable man, one of the most remarkable in American history. Well, have a good day.